Welcome to the segment where I review movies, past and present, examining them from a variety of perspectives, including the subjective, psychological, and personal. Informative and occasionally funny, this is LoganLand Rants. Welcome to LoganLand Rants, and today we're talking about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's a pretty old movie, like 1939, so my great-grandparents who are still alive will probably have seen it. But it's a really phenomenal political comedy, and I'd also like to point out, before I dive too deeply into this rabbit hole, that apparently the Spider-Man 2 podcast from the last time, it was probably the most disliked of these LoganLand Rants, probably because I was the only one who, said real stuff. Yeah, some people don't like living in the reality we live in, but anyway. Also, Onward was pretty disliked. I'm not 100% sure why, and also my Jojo Rabbit video essay had like 1 dislike and 3 likes. So score 1 for Antifa, fascist 0. But anyway, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is also kind of political, but it's more about corruption than anything going on right now. It's about a very idealistic, junior congressman, I guess you call it. They explain it better in the movie, how the whole system works, but basically, he, played by the great actor Jimmy Stewart from yesteryear, he becomes a junior congressman, decides to set up what's, by all accounts, a pretty progressive policy. And then the Congress people turn against him, and he heroically filibusters to his exhausting breath and inevitably wins by getting moved other congressmen who orchestrated everything to admit to all of his corruption, and it all works out. Obviously, it's significantly more idealistic than most modern politicians will probably view it as, or maybe view the issue as more complicated than it actually is. But Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is an example of what can happen when a political comedy about Congress, or political dramedy about Congress, can also be timeless. Because it is really great. Even for a black and white movie, I think that the thematic material transcends the test of time, almost in a Shakespearean way. Not quite Shakespearean, because Shakespearean transcends the test of time for a very different reason. But Mr. Smith Goes to Washington doesn't necessarily foreshadow our current political landscape, but it certainly makes it more believable. And, I think it's interesting just watching it in high school. It was the first, other than Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush, it was the first black and white movie I saw and actually thoroughly enjoyed in high school. I think I saw it for a government class. I had to write a paper on it. That cracking you heard was my knuckles. And it's just interesting. I really liked it. And normally I don't like black and white movies, or didn't in high school. Obviously, I love black and white movies. Anyone who's a longtime fan of these podcasts knows that for sure. But it's one of those things that you find interesting. Normally, I was watching this video by Steven Spielberg, who said that he sometimes gets his kids to watch black and white movies. And at first they groan because it's black and white. But then within 10 minutes, they don't know if it's black and white or color. They just enjoy the movie. And I think that's really interesting. And, it's interesting, just generally. I think black and white movies can be incredibly thematic, and I think there's a lot that makes a good thriller, but I haven't watched that video from Spielberg on the American Film Institute. That's the channel it comes from. But Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is great for all these reasons, and obviously it's not for everyone. If you don't like black and white movies, or the old talkies as we call them, they certainly won't be for everyone, but I really think it transcends the test of time in a lot of different ways. And I wish there was more to say. I podcasted a long time last week because there was a whole lot to say about current events as much as Spider-Man 2. And I don't know, I can imagine getting a little bit of backlash for this, but I don't think it'll be quite as severe as, any time I've made a political statement ever. So, with all that in mind, I hope you like, subscribe, or pledge to my channel. I thank you for everyone who subscribed recently. And I'll see you next week with a brand new podcast. Bye.